Chapter 8 is an interesting chapter, especially after we saw in chapter 7 that that the writer says that God brought rest upon David in verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass when the king was dwelling in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his enemies round about, that the Lord said that the king said unto Nathan," and so forth. But then we get to chapter 8, and we start seeing David just having all kinds of wars. And chapter 8 is an interesting chapter. And if you remember, I pointed out a week or so back that 2 Samuel doesn't always go in chronological order of things. They seem to, the writer tends to group the idea together. And in this particular case, when we look at chapter 8 and we see the wars of David, I don't tend to think that these were just one right after the other. They may have been, but I think this kind of stretched over a period of time. And I think that when you consider the type of warfare they had, and the devastating effect it had upon armies, you may have a war with one nation and you have to regroup and rearm and what have you. So it may be another year or so before another battle takes place. So when we look at chapter 8, it may or may not be something that just may happen, one right after the other, but it may have happened over a period of years, and the author just kind of grouped this together. It's kind of like when we looked at chapter 6, when David was moving the ark, and we looked at the account over in Chronicles. The account doesn't the account in 2 Samuel versus Chronicles doesn't run in the same chronological order. So when I look at Samuel, I see that he was more focused on the events of moving the ark, whereas the Chronicles was more focused on the idea of chronological events. So maybe that's why they call it Chronicles, I don't know. But be that as it may, when we look at chapter 8, we have to understand that chapter 7, when God said he gave David rest, doesn't mean he said he gave David peace. He just gave him a break in the course of events. So chapter 8, when we start looking at it, we start seeing what David had to go through in his lifetime. And this is an important chapter because what it does is it shows us David in his life and his responsibilities towards God was to establish the kingdom, to bring peace to the kingdom, so that when his son Solomon takes over the reign, he doesn't have to worry about his enemies. He focuses his attention on the building of the temple and establishing the religion in Jerusalem. So David's work was quite different from the work that Solomon had before him. So chapter 8 is the war chapter, and we're going to be talking a little bit about all of that. And when I sit down, usually I like to sit down and look at the people in the context and the locations in the context, but I didn't have a whole lot of time to put it all together the way I really wanted to, so we'll go through it like this. There's a lot of people that are listed in this particular context. Of course, we have David, we have the Philistines, Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, which is part of Syria, Toi, king of Hamath, Joram, Joab, Jehoshaphat, Zadok, Ahimelech, Benaniah, and of course David's sons. All of these people are mentioned, some in a little bit more detail than others, but these were the main characters that we see in this particular text. And they all play a significant part in what occurs. Now the locations, David was all over the place in this particular chapter. Some of these places are mentioned. We won't go into a whole lot of detail in them. Some of just cities that that are mentioned as far as getting tribute from, or places that he may have, some of the battles were located near. We have Methek, Ammah, Moab, Zobah of Syria, the river Euphrates, Beta, and I'm not going to mention the rest of it. Berethai, Syrians of Damascus, Jerusalem, Ammon, Philistia, Amalek, and the Valley of Salt, and Edom. Now Syria, I kind kind of like get a little bit confused about Syria, but it seems like Syria was consisting both of Zobah and the Syria itself, because we see Zobah of Syria, then we see Damascus of Syria. And it seems like these kings, when you see a king, it's not necessarily a king over a country, but maybe a king over a region. And I think maybe Zobah was part of a region of Syria. But we do know that when David had war with the king of Zobah, the Syrians were quick to jump in and get themselves in a fix also. So that's basically the context of the locations. Now, the chapter, as we look at it, consists of several parts. And most of these are just the wars that he has. In verse 1, we're told that he defeats the Philistines. Verse 2, the Moabites. 3 through 8, he defeats Zobah and Aram. 9 through 10, you see that King Hamath pays tribute to David. 11 through 12, the wealth that David recovers from his wars, he donates all of this to God. 13 through 14, he defeats Edom. Then we see David's rule of justice, and finally his cabinet members. Now, I didn't have a whole lot of time to work on maps, so I found this one and I threw it up there. I know you can really see this real good, right? So I'll point some things out to you. First of all, in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18, Abraham was told by God that the land that he would inherit would be, get back here. Okay, I gotta bring my little pointer up. That it would be from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. So when we look at this, the river of Egypt runs about right up through here, and the river Euphrates is right up here. So the land that Abraham was promised by God encompasses all of this. And when it was all said and done, this is what David's kingdom comprised of, and these wars brought this into reality. Now, when David first became king of Judah, that was just a little area right up in here. And then when Israel accepted him as king, that included this area right up through here. So David's kingdom at the time before all these wars took place encompassed this particular area of the map. And then of course their longtime nemesis, the Philistines, lived in this particular area right here. Now, to the next page. See, my fingers are not working the way they should these days. Okay. Now, his wars with Philistia, Ammon, Amalek, and Edom consisted of this area right here, the Philistines. The Amalekites were right up in here. Edom was right up through here. Moab was over here. And Ammon was right up through here. So when he got finished with his wars and he conquered these people and subdued them, all of these areas became, I guess, subject to the rule of David. So even though these people still lived there, he had control over this particular area. So now we see that the land from the Amalekites up through the lower part of the nation was now part of the nation of Israel. Now when we go to the top part of it, we see the area of Zobah here, and there's Damascus of Syria. In this particular region here with Syria, and you can see Israel kind of popping up along with my other things, this yellow part here. Now we saw earlier that Hiram of Tyre and Phoenicia made friends with David, and they were pretty much left alone, and David did not mess with them because he understood their friendship. And then Hamath, right up here, is the extent of the Euphrates River through here. So this is the top part of the nation. So when we look at these particular wars and we see that Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, was conquered, then Toi, the king of Hamath, was extremely happy about what David had done, because Zobah was trying to get his reign up to the Euphrates River. He's always trying to conquer this particular area. And so when David subdued them, he was happy and he made peace with David, and so he became subject to David's reign. Now, when we look at 2 Samuel, there's going to be a lot of question about why, or whether or not Zobah was creating the problems in trying to reclaim the area up to the river Euphrates, or does the text say that David was trying to get this particular area up here? The text is unclear about who was trying to claim that area, but that's where we were at. So, bottom line is, after all these wars, David extended his kingdom from the river Egypt all the way up to the river Euphrates, according to the promise that Israel had, God had made to Abraham. So everybody up with me so far? Okay. Now, battles fought and alliances made. He fought the Philistines, the Moabites, Zobah, which was part of Syria, the Syrians of Damascus, Ammon, and Edom. And he made an alliance with King Toi of Hamath. And so it brings us back to our chapter synopsis. Now, I think we can get through all this. The war with the Philistines, it says in verse 1 that David had taken the city of Metheg, which was Ammah from the Philistines. And according to Josephus, one thing I found interesting about going through 2 Samuel is if you take out Josephus's ecclesiastical history, or rather the Jewish history, and kind of read along with it, you kind of get the impressions of what the Jews thought a couple thousand years ago about events that happened back in the time of David. Now, Josephus says that David, after he conquered the Philistines, cut off a great part of their country and had joined it to the Hebrews. And this is found in Josephus book 7, chapter 5, in the first paragraph. And after he conquered them, they brought silver and gold to Jerusalem, and this was dedicated to the Lord. And you'll see as we go through chapter 8, whenever tribute was made to David, or when he ever confiscated the gold and silver and bronze from these countries, he never, or at least it's never told us that he kept it for himself, but rather it was dedicated to God. And these metals that he accrued were used in the construction of the Lord's temple under Solomon. So he was getting all this wealth, and he was stockpiling it for Solomon, and he was giving it to God. So the Philistine War, there's not a whole lot to it other than the fact that David had attacked the Philistines and subdued them. Then when we get to the War of the Moabites, this was a little bit different. Now the Moabites, as we know, were descendants from Abraham's nephew Lot. And so, they've got history together. In fact, a lot of these nations, they kind of go back to Abraham and some of his relatives, and so they're all kind of related to some extent. But the Moabites were descended from Lot, and we saw that in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 5. Now, when it also says that he forced them to the ground, and that is an indication that when he went to war with them, it was a total defeat. I mean, he beat the army, and he subdued them, and forcing them to the ground is pretty much saying he weakened them. But one thing that kind of stood out, and I think David Pratt in his book kind of takes one approach with it, other commentators take another approach, and Josephus takes an approach. But I think what it says here is that when he says that he forced them to the ground, he measured them off with a line with two lines. He measured off those to be put to death, and one full line those to be kept alive. So the Moabites became David's servants. Now we have two lines and we have one line. And what the account is saying here is that the group of people that David was working with here, or was fixing to put to death, 2/3 of them were put to death and 1/3 was left alive. Basically what the writer is saying here. What we don't know is, or at least what is not clear, is he talking about the nation itself, all the Moabites? Was 2/3 of them put to death and 1/3 left alive? Or was he talking about just the army itself? And if I'm not mistaken, I think David Pratt takes the approach that it was the nation itself that he pretty much committed genocide on. I think he takes the approach that 2/3 were killed, whereas 1/3 was not. Josephus and a lot of other commentators take the approach that he was just speaking about the army itself. When he subdued them down, forcing them down to the ground, he subdued the army, and then he destroyed what was left of the army. 2/3 of them were put to death and 1/3 was left alive. So basically what it comes down to is Moab was left defenseless, and the inhabitants of the land didn't have any way of confronting David again in the future. So in that respect, he was able to subdue the Moabites and caused them to bring tribute to David, and he kept them under his control because militarily they could not bring force against him again. I tend to take that approach also. I don't think that it would make sense that he would destroy the nation itself when all he really needed to do was just destroy the force that could bring problems back to him. And again, this is found in Josephus chapter 7, or book 7, chapter 5, in the first paragraph. And also Josephus says that the tribute that they brought was an annual tribute. So, you know, when you think about gaining wealth from these countries, David required that, you know, we're going to do this as long as I'm king. You're going to continue to bring wealth to me. And so it was not a one-time ordeal. It was something that was consistently done. You keep the nation poor, build up my coffers, and you will not be able to support an army. You know, and a way of thinking militarily, that was probably the best thing David could have done to keep peace during Solomon's reign. Now, the war with King Hadadezer of Zobah, as we saw, it was a kingdom to the north of them, situated in Syria. And historically, Saul was able to successfully fight them and overcome their armies back in 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 47. And we'll see later on that even after David conquers them in this particular chapter, they again create some issues over in chapter 10, and we'll talk about that in a week or so. But and at that time, Joab again, at this time, brings war against them and conquers them. Now, what is unclear about this is when we look at verse 3, he says, David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, the king of Zobah, as he went to recover his territory at the river Euphrates. Now, I'm not an English master of any kind, so when I look at this, I stop and think, who was doing the recovering of the territory? Was it the king of Zobah, or was it David? And I don't know. It may have been King Zobah, because in order to recover that particular land up towards the Euphrates, he had to give Toi, the king of Hamath, some problems because he's bringing his armies through his land and trying to conquer that land. So there was constant war between the king of Zobah and the king of Hamath. So when David got involved, was David the one trying to reclaim that area, or was it King? I don't know. All I know is that someone was trying to reclaim the territory up towards that particular river. Now, if it was the king itself, David was on his way to say, no, this land belongs to us because it was promised by God to Abraham. If it was David on his way up there to get that land because he said it belongs to us because God gave it to Abraham, and the king of Zobah was standing in his way and says, no, you're not going to go through this land. Well, I don't know how the war started, but I do know how the war ended. It says that David took David took from him 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 foot soldiers. Now there's a discrepancy between here and what you read over in 1 Corinthians about the number of horsemen. And I think it says 700 here. When you go to 1 Chronicles 18, it says 7,000. And I've went through a bunch of different commentators trying to figure out if there's a resolution to this. And about the only thing that people come up with is that when you look at the Hebrew numbering system, there's no numbering system, but rather it's a statement of numbers. And they said more than likely this is the people that were copying these documents made an error in the way the words were kind of related, and some of the Hebrew words were dropped off. I don't know, but I think the vast majority think that it was just a copyist error. Does that matter? Does that say that the Word of God is inaccurate? I don't think so. I think that even though we may have this kind of error in the document, it does not take away from our faith, because this is it's really insignificant. It's a statement of the number of people that were actually horsemen. It's kind of like, well, Chronicles says that these events happened in this order. 2 Samuel says it happens in this order, so therefore we have discrepancies. Not necessarily, it's just the way the people put the two accounts together. Again, if you go back to Josephus, he says 7,000. And so I think that the correct number should be 7,000 and not 700. And I think that better fits the account because of the number of chariots that were there and the number of footmen. The larger number of horsemen would accommodate that size of an army. David defeats them. He hamstrings the horses, and he destroys all but 100 of the chariots. And he keeps 100 horses, I guess, for those chariots. So I guess I'm not a farmer of any kind, but they say that when you hamstring an animal, you pretty much take away his strength. About the only thing he's good for is just maybe pulling a plow or just menial work. He's no longer able to function as a strong animal that can be used in war. And this was in keeping, I think, David's keeping of the law of Moses about not accumulating horses or placing your trust in horses, which Samuel which Solomon did, and that was one of his downfalls. But I think David understood this and was not about to find himself in a position of placing his faith in those particular animals. In fact, when you look over in Psalms chapter 20, in verse 7, David says, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God and not place our trust in them." So his placing his trust in the name of the Lord God and not in the physical animals. So anyway, he subdues them, and when the Syrians of Damascus came to help King Hadadezer, David killed 22,000 of the Syrians, and then he put garrisons, that is, a large number of his army in Damascus and Syria to keep the peace or keep the rule under David's command in those areas, and they brought him tribute also. And it says the Lord preserved David wherever he went. He took shields of gold that belonged to the servants, brought them to Jerusalem, and also from Beta and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, and King David took large amounts of bronze. And from what I can understand, I think back then bronze was considered to be a more valuable metal than gold itself. I don't know. That's what some people were saying. Now, King Toi of Hamath, which was above Zobah, was happy that David had conquered his enemy. And I guess in his mind is the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so he sends his son down to David with tribute, and I guess gifts to give to David, and makes peace with him. And so even though David did not physically conquer him, I think that David now had control over Toi, Hamath, in that particular area. So he dedicated those things to the Lord. Now, the next thing we see in verse 13 is the war with the Syrians. I think that's right. It says that David made himself a name when he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. Now, the Valley of Salt, from what I understand, is located on the southern end of the Dead Sea, kind of in the area of where the Edomites were at. There may be another Valley of Salt located elsewhere. It would seem to me, it would seem to be a different Valley of Salt also. But anyway, at any point, he met the Syrians in the Valley of Salt a second time and put them, I guess, in their place, I'm not going to say. And maybe they have been there to help the Edomites. I don't know. But anyway, we see in verse 13 that he subdues the Syrians in the Valley of Salt, and he puts garrisons in Edomites throughout all of Edom. He put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. So it seems to me that maybe the Syrians and the Edomites got together and think we might be able to conquer David in this particular, if we were to put our forces together. But that didn't happen. So not only did David kill 22,000 Syrians over in verse 8, he adds another 18,000 to them in verse 13. So it seems to me that this might have happened a little bit later on down the road, or at least, maybe at least a couple of years later. But he kills 18,000 Syrians, and he puts garrisons in their place, and it's literally, it says that God would cause David to be victorious over all of his servants. And it also says that David made himself a name when he returned from this battle. Now, we have to understand that the name that David made for himself was that all the nations around him was looking at David and was saying, David's a mighty warrior. We fear him. This is a man that we have to understand that he's a mighty man. I guess you could say he's an Alexander the Great of his era. And so he made a name for himself. But that name was not made by David. It was a name that God had made for him, because it says that wherever David went, back up in verse 6, it says, so the Lord preserved David wherever he went. So it was the Lord actually making this name for David. But David had enough sense to know that his good fortunes and his strength came from God, and he was not about to take this glory upon himself, but he gave that back to God. So David puts Edom under his control, and for those that, we have to understand too, the Edomites were descendants of Esau, and Esau was the son of Jacob and a brother of Isaac. So again, we see that the Edomites, to some extent, had some family connections with the nation of Israel. Then the next two nations that we look at, Ammon and Amalek, not a whole lot is said there. Over in verse 12, it says that David, let me get back over there. In verse 12 it said, from Syria, from Moab, from the people of Ammon, from Philistines, and Amalek, and from the spoil of the king of Zobah. So David now has put all these nations under his control. So when we looked at that map, and we saw, Judah, we saw Israel, and we saw the nations around them, David, through his military strength and the protection of God, was able to put all of his enemies that were causing him trouble at rest. And I guess at this particular point, he was beginning to have peace from his nations around him, so that through military conquest, he was able to accomplish God's goal in bringing peace to the nation for Solomon. Now, down through history, these nations, even though they may be subdued at this particular time, they never did stay subdued historically. They rose up against them several times, and eventually we see where the nation of Israel, after the division and the falling away, were taken into captivity by their surrounding nations. So after David has done all of this, he has placed garrisons in all of these countries. In other words, he's had his military strength is placed in all of these countries to keep nations from building their armies up, to causing problems again for Israel. The armies were there to keep the peace, to ensure that tribute was being paid to David, and there's another reason I was going to put there. Anyway, at least for those two particular reasons. Same thing had happened in Israel when the Romans conquered Israel. They placed their garrisons throughout the nation, and the nation was subject to Roman rule. Same thing happened here. David placed his garrison there, and they became subject to David. Now, the last part of the chapter, from verses 15 to the end, we see where David now begins to set up his government and the rule of the nation of Israel. Several things are stated here, at least three things. We see that we see a little bit about his government and his legal system that he established. We know that David reigned as king over all Israel, and then the text tells us that he executed judgment and justice. So David was on top of what was happening in his kingdom. And it also says at the end of the verse that his sons were chief ministers. They were, I guess, his right-hand men at the throne. In other words, when David made decisions, his ministers made sure that they happened. And they, I guess you might say, were considered vice presidents. I don't know. But they were, he did set up his sons as important ministers or functionaries in his government. And then we see Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder. And from what I can understand about the function of the recorder back then is that they were representatives of the king in political and financial matters. So if they had a financial situation that needed to be taken care of, David used this man to take care of it. If there was political matters that he had to deal with someplace off, this was the man that took care of it. So he was the representative of the king in that function. So we have David and his sons in the functionary role, and we have Jehoshaphat as his recorder and other representative matters. Then we see the military system that David set up. Joab, we know, was his nephew, and he was commander over all the army. Benaniah, son of I have trouble with these names, was over both the Cherethites and the Perethites. Couldn't find out a whole lot about these people, these group of men. We seem to think that the Cherethites was a tribe that was inhabiting the Negev system of Philistia, which was a southern area, and the Pelethites, nothing at all was known about them. But they were loyal to David because they were the ones that went with David when he evacuated from Jerusalem, as we'll see later on in this chapter. And it's also thought that this was the people that David originally had assembled when he was down in Ziklag, in that particular area when we began our study. Now, considering the nation itself and the army, you might want to think of this group as David's personal bodyguard. And then the religious system, he had two priests, Zadok and Ahimelech, and Sariah was the scribe. So what can we learn from all this? Not just to go through this real quickly, and put it up there. Lessons learned. God kept his promises to David. We can be assured that God will keep his promises to us. You cannot resist God like the nations tried, but he will triumph over those who seek to do his children harm. Like David, do not be greedy. Everything on earth belongs to God. Do not lust after what is not yours. And then finally, our strength and good name will be held by our faith and trust in God and making our lives his. And that's how David's good name was held. So anyway, any questions? If we can come up with some, we'll talk about them Wednesday night. Just flag me down before we get started. Thanks for your attention.